All right, welcome back to Smart Reads. It's Wednesday, 4 o'clock-ish. Today's the anniversary of autonomy, so it's the autoniversary. Happy autoniversary to all of you who have made it to this call today. I see several people already online to hear the words of Neil Postman in this book, Technopoly. Technocracy is this other book. I'll slide that into the book cam real quick. Technocracy Rising by Patrick Wood is a recent book. People consider that conspiratorial, though most of the topics that are discussed in Technopoly by Neil Postman in 1992 are also in Technocracy Rising by Patrick Wood. So sometimes topics can be discussed in a very establishment way, and then people can take other pieces of information, add them in a book like this that I think has a lot more context that's useful to today. Of course, people wouldn't want you to read that. This is not easily available. This Technopoly, that's probably in Barnes & Noble and any other bookseller. It's a very establishment-y type of book. So what we're going to look at today is this book that is fascinating. I'm going to start by reading from the inside cover, because then we'll have an idea of what Postman was offering in this and why you might want to check it out. I'll be reading selections from this book as we go through. And if you guys want to ask questions, add comments, observations, contradict what he's saying, all these sort of fun things, that's part of the interactive nature of this format. So it's not supposed to be, because if it's just me reading quotes from the book, I can do that and not have to be on time for a meeting. And I can like edit in post-production. So this whole idea of do it live is so that you guys can participate too, and you're well qualified and practiced to be able to participate in such a forum and add value to anyone else who watches this in the replay and beyond into the YouTube world. Any questions before we get started today? Excellent. All right, so Neil Postman offers here his most brilliant, let me get it all lined up, and forceful arguments yet about the form and content of American culture. For many historical and social reasons, he warns, the United States is in danger of being a technopoly, a system in which technology of every kind is cheerfully granted sovereignty over social institutions and national life and becomes self-justifying, self-perpetuating, and omnipresent. Postman traces the historical movement of technology from being a support system for a culture's traditions to competing with those traditions, and finally to creating a totalitarian order with no use for tradition at all. As he shows, technology comes irresistibly to redefine what we mean by religion, by art, by family, by politics, by history, by truth, by privacy, and by intelligence, so that all new definitions fit the requirements of the technological thought world. As a consequence, alternative ways of living and believing becoming invisible and irrelevant, and the possibilities of other narratives that might serve to organize national purpose are driven out of consciousness. Postman examines the specific ways in which technology tyrannizes over everything, from medical practice to bureaucracy to politics to religion. With characteristic pungency and wit, he inveighs against the false claims of social science, for example, as well as the subversion of humane values by misunderstood techniques of information storage, retrieval, and dissemination. Tools and technologies are certainly indispensable to any culture, but, he argues, we must, flip to the back cover, we must understand and control them, place them in context, let me get it in camera, of a larger human needs, our social values, our national intentions. In a technopoly, he makes clear, individuality is undermined and freedom is perverted. In a true democracy, the essential elements of technical skill, expressed most basically in our language and in our educational system, can be used to strengthen and support the best in human endeavors. Now, I'm going to close the book for a second. Let's unpack that, because here's what I feel. I feel for some people, especially if you're watching on YouTube, just reading the jacket of a book and trying to internalize that information can be a struggle because everyone's attention spans are so, that's like a bunch of tweets right there. That's a lot of characters. That's a whole bunch. For other people, yeah, it's the inside of a jacket. We didn't even open the book yet, right? So this is the dichotomy. There are people who are far beyond reading the inside jacket of a book. That's something they do a lot and have done a lot. And for other people, it's a struggle just to make it through and hold their attention that long. So the idea is, as I unpack each quote, we add a little context. We have a little Q&A if there's any questions about what he meant or how it's being applied, or if you can think of examples, these sort of things. And then ultimately it helps serve us by getting that dialogue and asking those questions and finding answers together. But it also enriches anybody who's just passively watching this, because they start to elongate their attention span, be able to inform themselves in a more structured way. And the best way to start is like clearing the slate and figuring out what exactly going on here. Last week we talked about, or it was 2 weeks ago in Smart Reads, Edward Bernays' propaganda. It's not to learn how to propagandize people. It's to learn that it's like water to fish. We're swimming in propaganda all over the place. Learning how to recognize it gives us the ability to ask questions, have choices, and that's freedom. And so going back to the quote that I always drop, that's, it's sad but true. Literacy is a form of slavery until the individual reader practices a method of critical thinking consistently. So until you have that consistent method of critical thinking about what you're reading, people believe what they read. They read all those declarative sentences. They believe them. They're not asking questions. And therefore that's a literal form of mind control. I bring that up because it's one of the first questions dealt with in Postman's book. When we get to chapter 1, it's going to ask the question, like, is reading and writing something that adds benefit to human beingness, and what has changed since it's been integrated into human beingness, right? So kind of deep ideas we'll wade in step by step. All right, so let me cut back to the book here. We'll give you a little full screen, and I'll show you the fontus page, this sort of thing, cover page. Technopoly. Neil Postman, The Surrender of Culture to Technology, 1992. Whether or not it draws on new scientific research, technology is a branch of moral philosophy, not of science. Paul Goodman, as quoted from The New Reformation. Contents. We're going to talk about chapter 1, a little bit chapter 2 and chapter 3, and then maybe we'll see how long we have for the later chapters. Let's start with the important stuff. This part right here. Let's go to this screen right here. The Judgment of Thamus. You will find in Plato's Phaedrus a story about Thamus, a king of a great city of Upper Egypt. For people such as ourselves who are inclined, in Thoreau's phrase, to be tools of our tools, few legends are more instructive than his. The story, as Socrates tells to his friend Phaedrus, unfolds in the following way. Thamus once entertained the god Thoth, who was the inventor of many things, including number, calculation, geometry, astronomy, and writing. Thoth exhibited his inventions to King Thamus, claiming that they should be made widely known and available to Egyptians. Socrates continues. Thamus inquired into the use of each of them, and as Thoth went through them and expressed approval or disapproval, according to as he judged Thoth's claims to be well or ill-founded. It would take too long to go through all that which Thamus is reported to have said, for and against each of Thoth's inventions, but when it came to writing, Thoth declared, "Here is an accomplishment, my lord the king, which will improve," let's try that again. "Here is an accomplishment, my lord the king, which will improve the wisdom and the memory of the Egyptians. I have discovered a sure receipt for memory and wisdom." End quote. To this Thamus, the king, replied, quote, "Thoth, my paragon of inventors, the discoverer of an art, is not the best judge of the good or harm which will accrue to those who practice it. So it is in this, you, who are the father of writing, have, out of fondness for your offspring, attributed to quite an opposite of its real function. Those who acquire it will cease to exercise their memory and become forgetful. They will rely on writing to bring things to their remembrance by external signs instead of their own internal resources. What you have discovered is a receipt for recollection, not for memory. And as for wisdom, your pupils will have a reputation for it without the reality. They will receive the quantity of information without proper instruction, and in consequence be thought very knowledgeable when they are for the most part quite ignorant. And because they are filled with the conceit of wisdom instead of real wisdom, they will be a burden to society. End quote. Postman continues here. I begin my book with this legend because in Thamus's response there are several sound principles from which we may begin to learn how to think with wise circumspection about a technological society. In fact, there is even one error in the judgment of Thamus from which we may also learn something of importance. The error is not in his claim that writing will damage memory and create false wisdom. It is demonstrable that writing has had such an effect. Thamus's error is in his believing that writing will be the burden to society and nothing but a burden. For all his wisdom, he fails to imagine that writing's benefits might be, or what writing's benefits might be, which, as we know, have been considerable. We may learn from this that it is a mistake to suppose that any technological invention has a one-sided effect. Every technology is both a burden and a blessing, not either or, but this and that. Nothing could be more obvious, of course, especially to those who have given more than 2 minutes of thought to the matter. Nonetheless, we are currently surrounded by throngs of zealous thoths, one-eyed prophets who see only what new technologies can do and are incapable of imagining what they will undo. What we might call such people technophiles. They gaze on technology as a lover does on his beloved, seeing it without blemish and entertaining no apprehension for the future. They are therefore dangerous and to be approached cautiously. On the other hand, some one-eyed prophets, such as I, or so I am accused, are inclined to speak only of burdens in the matter of Thamus, and are silent about the opportunities that new technologies make possible. The technophiles must speak for themselves, and do so all over the place. My defense is that a dissenting voice is sometimes needed to moderate the din made by the enthusiastic multitudes. If one is to err, it is to better err on the side of Thamusian skepticism, but it is an error nonetheless. And I might note that, with the exception of his judgment on writing, Thamus does not repeat this error. All right, so I'm gonna dip out there. All right, so let's talk about that for a second. Were any of you familiar with that dialogue? Socrates, Phaedrus, Thamus, Thoth. The notion that writing is a form of technology, that those symbols is a form of technology that wasn't widely adopted. And at some point, it did come into what we know as Western society. And there's earlier forms of writing found other places in the world. So it's not saying that the myth is true, but what can you take from that? And did you ever consider that? Because we are surrounded by a bunch of technophiles who rapidly encourage the adoption of new technologies without ever really showing us what it takes away. Like every time there's a gain in technology, something is lost, something becomes obsolete. And it's a balance of that opportunity cost that leads to freedom. And what Postman is saying, in the absence of making those decisions and weighing that cost, that's not freedom.
Are you waiting for a response?
Well, if anyone had a comment or question or some insight, or that moved you in some way?
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind was to remember that those group of peoples, they were mainly oral people, right? Orality was the main thing. And so somehow writing allow them to move beyond that state of, I don't know if it to be more cultural maybe, but I think that we are becoming more oral now because like if you talk about any product or anything in our society, the first thing that people do is they go to YouTube to see if they can see more about that product and so I think that we're becoming a very oral society, and that scares me because I think what moves us to become, I want to use the word civilized. I don't know if that's politically incorrect, but I'll use it. It scares me that we are sort of becoming an oral society instead of defending good writing and best practices.
Well, and I think that your insight has some wisdom to it because we went from, and I almost want to give a more specific name to what you're observing though, because we went from an oral society where we had epic poems and people recited these poems and they weren't written down. And that's how people, had continuity of memory, was through the various meters of poetry to be able to recall what comes next. And then it went into the absence of being able to do that because you have reading involved. And now what you have is you have an oral society, but it's not everyone speaking to each other. It's a very few people manufacturing a message. And when we get through the rest of the books in this series, you're going to see it's manufacturing your consent. It's engineering your consent artificially. And so that's the use of the writing technology at even higher volume because it's not equal for people. And though the internet provides that potential, it hasn't really been ignited or catalyzed yet. Like it still exists there to be. Someone can develop something that can really make that, happen, develop into the world instead of it just being a concept. But you're right. There's a lot more control through them using writing in a propaganda way through mass media. Like mainstream media has proven that for the last century. And it's only getting worse with people having shorter attention spans, being connected to their phones, and what their phones are connected to are not things that are helping them attain cognitive liberty in life. So then the question is, what is the phone and how is its form and function used in your life as an asset or a liability?
Hey, Rich. Josh.
How you doing, Josh?
Pretty good. Yeah, so I never heard any of those, aside from Socrates, but some of the other characters I'm not familiar with. And I never thought that writing was a form of technology. So that's very interesting. So as I'm listening to you, you were saying how technology, as it advances, it makes past things become obsolete. So that's interesting. If we look at language, this language has evolved to English to what we have now and how much it's changed, and also how ambiguous our language can be and how many words are so similar and how the message can be so distorted now versus like maybe Latin. It seems like I don't know a lot about Latin, but I've been interested in learning that because it seemed like it was a little bit more clear. But anyways, that was my point. Never thought of it as a technology. That's very interesting.
Right on. All right. So that's a good start because here's how he brings this first chapter to an end. Let me put the book back on screen. New technologies alter the structure of our interests, the things we think about. They alter the character of our symbols, the things we talk with. They alter the nature of community, the arena in which thoughts develop. As Themis spoke to Innes across the centuries, it is essential that we listen to their conversation, to join it, revitalize it. For something has happened in America that is strange and dangerous, and there is only a dull and even stupid awareness of what it is, in part because it has no name. I call it Technopoly. So chapter 2, he opens up from tools to technocracy. So he's saying that there's tool using cultures, and then they adopt these tools into their cultures, and it start to take control. And then it comes to the point where these tools actually end up governing us. And that's the technocracy aspect. And he was, as we just talked about last week in History Connected in the other studio, the background on Neil Postman was that he was a graduate of Columbia Teachers College. Columbia University in 1932 and 1934 created the technocracy movement, the technocracy study course, to use scientism to rule over people as a replacement for people having free will and any say that goes on in their lives. These are very establishment ideas. This is what, people's tuitions ended up paying for. Corporations pay for research over at those universities. It's a lot of things going on, but it's very few times thinking in our best interests. Among the more famous aphorisms from the troublesome pen of Karl Marx is his remark in The Poverty of Philosophy that the hand loom gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist, end quote. As far as I know, Marx did not say which technology gives us the technocrat, and I'm certain his vision did not include the emergence of the technopolist. Let me turn the light on the book. Nonetheless, the remark is useful. Marx understood well that, apart from their economic implications, technologies create the ways in which people perceive reality, and that such ways are the key to understanding diverse forms of social and mental life. In the German ideology, he says, quote, as individuals express their life, so they are, end quote, which sounds much like Marshall McLuhan, or, for that matter, famous as it is possible to sound. Indeed, toward the end of that book, Marx includes a remarkable paragraph that would be entirely at home in McLuhan's Understanding Media. Quote, unquote, quote, is Achilles possible, end quote. He asks, quote, when powder and shot have been invented, and is the Iliad possible at all when the printing press and even the printing machines exist? This gets to Hedda Marie's point right here. That with the emergence of the press, the singing and the telling of the muse cease. That is, the conditions for epic poetry disappear? End quote. By connecting technological conditions to symbolic life and psychic habits, Marx was doing nothing unusual. Before him, scholars had found it useful to invent taxonomies of culture based on the technological character of an age. Skipping down to the bottom. I find it necessary for the purpose of clarifying our present situation and indicating what dangers lie ahead to create still another taxonomy. Cultures may be classified into three types: tool-using cultures, technocracies, and technopolies. At the present time, each may be found somewhere on the planet, although the first is rapidly disappearing. We must travel to exotic places to find tool-using culture. If we do, it is to go well armed with that knowledge that, until the 17th century, all cultures were tool users. But now they're all technopolies or technocracies. There was, of course, considerable variation from one culture to another in the tools that were available. Some only had spears and cooking utensils. Some had water mills, coal, and horsepower. But the main characteristics of all tool-using cultures is that their tools were largely invented to do two things: to solve specific and urgent problems of physical life, such as in the use of water power, windmills, and the heavy-wheeled plow, or to serve the symbolic world of art, politics, myth, ritual, and religion, as in the construction of castles and cathedrals and the development of a mechanical clock. That was done by monks in the 13th century. In either case, tools did not attack, or more precisely, were not intended to attack the dignity and integrity of the culture into which they were introduced. With some exceptions, tools did not prevent people from believing in their traditions, in their God. For instance, the clock was invented by monks. They were serving God. Postman tells a story probably in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. So as he relates it, and you could probably find a public speech where he gives the same recounting, the idea was The monks were using sundials. They've got to practice their ritual 7 times a day, something like this. They were trying to do a more precise timing of their rituals, so they came up with a mechanical clock. That then led centuries later to scientism and Frederick Taylorism, the use of scientific management on schools and workers. That's going to be later in this book. And so it's ironic that, inventions, technologies go into the world created by individuals or groups, and then the intention of that creation of technology does not go with that technology, and oftentimes they can be used for ironically, the opposite purpose that they're created. All right, let's continue on here. We're at the clocks part when I went on my tangent. With some exceptions, the tools. Let's see, that's where we were. With some exceptions, tools do not prevent people from believing in their traditions, in their God, in their politics, in their methods of education, or in the legitimacy of their social organization. These beliefs, in fact, directed the invention of tools and limited the uses to which they were put. This sort of governance of military technology was not known in the Western world. He's talking about Bushido, the Japanese rituals, and how they would only use swords in certain situations. The use of the lethal crossbow was prohibited under threat of anathema by Pope Innocent II in the early 12th century. The weapon was judged to be, quote, hateful to God, end quote, and therefore could not be used against Christians. That it could be used against Muslims and other infidels does not invalidate the point that in a tool using culture, technology is not seen as autonomous and is subject to the jurisdiction of some binding social or religious system. Then he goes on. Let's see. He might talk about the clocks in this book, but I didn't. Some of his explanations on these get long-winded. So let's move to the next point that I had marked for consideration. This is coming from chapter 3. Let's see. He's talking about the plausible dates for technocracy. He was saying that Francis Bacon was the first technocrat. And in this part he writes, and I read, an equally plausible date for the beginnings of technocracy, and for Americans, easier to remember, is 1776, when Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was published. As Bacon was no scientist, Smith was no inventor. But, like Bacon, he provided a theory that gave conceptual relevance and credibility to the direction in which human enterprise was pointed. Specifically, he justified the transformation from small-scale, personalized, skilled labor to large-scale, impersonal, mechanized production. He not only argued convincingly that money, not land, was the key to wealth, but gave his famous principle of the self-regulating market. In a technocracy, that is, a society only loosely controlled by social custom and religious tradition, and driven by the impulse to invent, an unseen hand will eliminate the incompetent and reward those who produce cheaply and well the goods that people want. It was not clear then, and it still isn't, whose unseen mind guides the unseen hand, but it is possible. The technocratic industrialists believed that God could have something to do with it. And if not God, then, quote, human nature, end quote, for Adam Smith had named our species, quote, economic man, end quote, born with an instinct to barter and acquire wealth. So right there, I think we'll take a pause break to see if there's any thoughts percolating on your end, or if you just like being read stories. Because otherwise, I'm going to jump into it. It turns into a different conversation from there. So who's got questions, comments, observations, insights, compliments, or complaints?
Richard, I'll chime in.
How you doing, Michael?
I'm doing well. I do want to. Adam Smith essentially did I think, do something, a very good service for a lot of people in regard to kind of promoting this idea of the unseen hand in the marketplace as being one in which, we can really derive a lot of good things from. And I really think that was an era in time when, the American colonists really had the opportunity to freedom to exploit, something that the autonomy, what I think autonomy is trying to do in regard to giving people the, their own authority to adopt technology and so forth, and really push it forward. The steamboat, for example, although it was done by Fulton, or it was promoted by Fulton, was really a technology that kind of sat still for quite a few years before it came to America and it was really allowed to become something that was useful to other people. Prior to that, it had been tried in I think England or France, and essentially the bureaucrats made it impossible for the people to make it actually happen. And so I think the fact that Adam Smith is in there, that we're talking about this ideology, and then there's people that are willing and able to apply it, was really a key to, I think, what later became the overproduction that the technocrats had to get rid of.
Well, and there's a couple interesting points. The point of overproduction, that was a real thing back in the 1800s. They worried about that. The ideas about Robert Fulton and the steam engine and how that technology existed, but it took somebody to showcase and market it in a practical application for people to kind of say, oh, okay, that might be something that can help. And then that propelled the Industrial Revolution. And even to this day, there are many people who have electricity. It's generated by steam turbines that are run either by a nuclear or coal plant, right? That it's boiling water still. They call it a nuclear plant, make it sound all complicated, but they're using nuclear fission to boil water and turn a turbine, which is 1800s technology. So it gets back to the point of, we're not going to get any better at creating electricity in a more efficient format until we understand the form and function of what electricity is and what role it plays in life before we can understand it to be able to do it more efficiently, right? So the technology that builds up over time seems to benefit people, but there's always trade-offs. And I think we've gotten to a point today where technology is being adopted so much more rapidly than it was in 1992 when Postman wrote this book. And there's not enough people not dissenting. I'm not saying dissent for no reason. I'm saying question. And the reason for questioning is so you can learn what are the ins and outs before you get engaged with it. I noticed that people over the last 10 or 15 years have adopted so much technology that they just surround themselves with the electronic gulag and they don't know it, right? I might use some devices, but I'm like, yeah, there's, whatever, 6 microphones and that and 3 cameras or whatever. I at least have an awareness that stuff's around, the Internet of Things, right? Other people were just completely, hey, Alexa, record everything that goes on in their household to be used against us and the whatever, right? Your arguments, how you characterize whatever. Like, I can only imagine what they're collecting with people just putting those microphones throughout their house. And they've even leaked the information that it's being recorded, and they have third-party contractors transcripting everything. But people can't make a better decision because right now they don't have the comparison and contrast. They just think it's all good. So to know there's a reputable book that kind of brings up some of these questions, and now this gives people who are inclined to learn such things, interesting things to talk about at the holiday parties, and maybe an interesting piece of media to share. It's like, hey, check this out. Then you have something in common to talk about. Instead of being in conflict, you guys can actually make progress in these types of relationships where you're on one side, they're on the other. You've been over there, they haven't been over here. What needs to be done to get them across that bridge of communication? Right. Let's dip back. Where were we? Chapter 3. All right. We were there with Adam Smith. This is the next page. This is page 42. Let me cut to some camera angle for you. Boom. We had learned how to invent things and the question of why we invent things receded in importance. The idea if something could be done, it should be done was born in the 19th century. And along with it, there developed a profound belief in all the principles through which invention succeeds: objectivity, efficiency, expertise, standardization, measurement, and progress. It came to be believed that the engine of technological progress worked most efficiently when people are conceived when people are conceived of not as children of God or as even citizens, but as consumers. That is to say, as markets. That is to say, as markets. Not everyone agreed, of course, especially with the last notion. So I don't really agree with that notion either. So I'm reading along. I ask questions while I read. So I got to this part, and the names, Carlisle, Ruskin, and these guys that come up, I'm like, well, I disagree with a lot of things that they say, but actually you'll find out. We might all agree on this one point. Not everyone agreed, of course, especially with the last notion. In England, William Blake wrote of the, quote, dark satanic mills, end quote, which stripped men of their souls. Matthew Arnold warned that, quote, faith in machinery, end quote, was mankind's greatest menace. Carlyle, John Ruskin, and William Morris railed against the spiritual degradation brought by industrial progress. Now, Ruskin, for those of you playing at home, that's the guy who inspired Cecil Rhodes to leave a last will and testament to say, bring America back into the empire. It was John Ruskin at Oxford. Matthew Arnold, I think he's also from Oxford. Kevin Cole has done a lot of research on Matthew Arnold. He's the guy who brings the trivium, the British like indoctrination style trivium, not the trivium method that you can use to liberate your brain. So bringing like re-anglifying, re-Englandizing America has been like a long time endeavor that started in the 1800s, got formalized in 1902 by Rhodes. And then by the time Postman is writing this in 1992, he can look back and see that even some of the people who weren't so friendly as far as American freedom, their observations on a different topic, like technology and its use in the day, had some validity. Let's see. Here's another part Kevin Cole will be interested in. The 19th century also saw the emergence of, quote, utopian, end quote, communities, of which perhaps the most famous, is Robert Owen's experimental community in Scotland called New Lanark. There, he established a model factory community providing reduced working hours, improved living conditions, and innovative education for children of workers. In 1824, Owen came to America and founded another utopia at New Harmony, Indiana. Although none of his other experiments endured, dozens were tried in an effort to reduce the human costs of technocracy. We also must not omit the mentioning of the rise and fall of the much maligned Luddite movement. The origin of this term is obscure, some believing that it refers to the actions of a youth named Ludlum, who, being told by his father to fix a weaving machine, proceeded instead to destroy it. In any case, between 1811 and 1816, there arose widespread support for workers who bitterly resented the new wage cuts, child labor, and elimination of laws and customs that had once protected skilled workers. Their discontent was expressed through the destruction of machines, mostly in the garment and fabric industry, and since then the term Luddite has come to mean an almost childish and certainly naive opposition to technology. But the people trying to desperately, But the historical Luddites were neither childish nor naive. They were people trying to desperately to preserve whatever rights, privileges, laws, and customs had given them justice in the older worldview. They lost. So did all the other 19th century naysayers. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton might well have been on their side. Perhaps Bacon as well. For it was not his intention that technology should be a blight or destroyer. Cutting next to, let's see. Even so, taken as a whole, the rise of technocracy would probably have pleased Bacon, for there can be no disputing that technocracy transformed the face of material civilization and went far toward relieving what Tocqueville called the disease of work. And though it is true that technocratic capitalism created slums and alienation, it is also true that such conditions were perceived as an evil in that they could and should be eradicated. That is to say, technocracies brought into being an increased respect for the average person whose potential and even convenience became a matter of compelling political interest and urgent social policy. The 19th century saw the extension of public education, laid the foundation of the modern labor union, and led to the rapid diffusion of literacy, especially in America, through the development of public libraries and increased importance of the general interest magazine. It would be an inadmissible simplification to claim that the Age of Enlightenment originated solely because of the emerging importance of technology in the 18th century, but it is quite clear that the great stress placed on individuality in the economic sphere had an irresistible resonance in the political sphere. In a technocracy, inherited royalty is both irrelevant and absurd. Technocracy gave us the idea of progress and of necessity loosened our bonds with tradition, whether political or spiritual. Technocracy filled the air with the promise of new freedoms and new forms of social organization. Technocracy also speeded up the world. There, on the wings of technocracy, the United States soared to unprecedented heights as a world power. That Jefferson, Adams, and Madison would have found at such a place uncomfortable, perhaps even disagreeable, did not matter. Nor did it matter that there were 19th century American voices, Thoreau, for example, who complained about what was being left behind. The first answer to the complaints was, "We leave nothing behind but the chains of a tool-using culture." The second answer was more thoughtful. Technocracy will not overwhelm us. And this was true to a degree. Technocracy did not entirely destroy the traditions of the social and symbolic worlds. Technocracy subordinated these worlds, yes, even humiliated them, but it did not render them totally ineffectual. Two opposing worldviews, the technological and the traditional, coexisted in an uneasy tension. The technological was the stronger, of course, but the traditional was there, still functional, still exerting influence, still too much alive to ignore. This is what we find documented not only in Mark Twain, but in the poetry of Walt Whitman, the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, the prose of Thoreau, the philosophy of Emerson, the novels of Hawthorne and Melville, and most vividly in all in Alexis de Tocqueville's monumental Democracy in America. In a world, two distinct thought worlds were rubbing against each other in 19th century America. With the rise of Technopoly, one of those thought worlds disappears. Technopoly eliminates alternatives to itself in precisely the way Aldous Huxley outlined it in Brave New World. It does not make them illegal. It does not make them immoral. It does not even make them unpopular. It makes them invisible and therefore irrelevant. And it does so by redefining what we meant or mean by religion, by art, by family, by politics, by history, by truth, by privacy, by intelligence, so that our definitions fit its new requirements. Technopoly, in other words, is totalitarian technocracy. As I write, parenthetically, in fact, it is the reason why I write, and parentheses, the United States is the only culture to have become a technopoly. It is a young technopoly, and we can assume that it wishes not merely to have been the first, but to remain the most highly developed. Let me get that straighter on screen. Therefore, it watches with a careful eye Japan and several European nations that are striving to become technopolies as well. To give a date to the beginnings of technopoly in America is an exercise in arbitrariness. It is somewhat like trying to say precisely when a coin you have flipped in the air begins its descent. You cannot see the exact moment it stops rising, and you know only that it has and is going the other way. Huxley himself identified the emergence of Henry Ford's empire as the decisive moment in the shift from technocracy to technopoly, which is why in his Brave New World time is reckoned as BF, before Ford, and AF, after Ford. Here we get to the good parts. Let's see. He's talking about trade associations, Louis Brandeis. They get down to scientific management. To give substance to the argument, Brandeis brought forward witnesses, mostly engineers and industrial managers, who claimed that the railroads could both increase wages and lower their costs by using principles of scientific management. Although Frederick W. Taylor was not present at the hearings, his name was frequently invoked as the originator of scientific management, and experts assured the commission that the system developed by Taylor could solve everyone's problems. The commission ultimately ruled against the railroad's application, mostly because it judged that the railroads were making enough money as things were, not because it believed in scientific management. But many people did believe, and the hearings projected Taylor and his system onto the national scene. In the years that followed, attempts were made to apply the principles of the Taylor system in the armed forces, in the legal profession, in the home, the church, and education. Eventually, Taylor's name and the specifics of his system faded into obscurity. It became invisible. You see how that comes together? The thing that ends up controlling becomes invisible. But his ideas about what culture is made of retain the scaffolding of the present-day American technopoly. I use this event as a fitting starting point because in Taylor's book, The Principles of Scientific Management, published in 1911, contains the first explicit and formal outline of the assumptions of the thought world of technopoly. These include the beliefs that the primary, if not the only goal of human labor and thought is efficiency, that technical calculation is in all respects superior to human judgment, that, in fact, human judgment cannot be trusted because it is plagued by laxity, ambiguity, and unnecessary complexity, that subjectivity is an obstacle to clear thinking, and that what cannot be measured either does not exist or is of no value, and that the affairs of citizens are best guided and conducted by experts. Now, in fairness to Taylor, who did not invent the term scientific management and who used it reluctantly, it should be noted that his system was originally devised to apply only to the industrial production. His intention was to make a science of the industrial workplace, which could not only increase profits, but also result in higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions for laborers. In his system, which included time and motion studies. Let's just pause there for a second. Time and motion studies is how people were jumping off Apple factories in China. Time and motion studies. You're getting paid like they're breaking time and motion into little tiny parts to make things like uber profitable, and they're using slave labor. Right. And even though people were jumping off the buildings and the suicide nets, there's a line around the block for people to get jobs there. That type of situation. That's not what Frederick W. Taylor was intending. That's what Postman's pointing out. So he intended, hey, it makes things better for workers, but how the ideas actually got implemented they were turned into systems of social control, and then hierarchically put through all these various industries, including the school system. Time and motion studies. The judgment of individual workers was replaced by laws, rules, and principles of science of their job. This did mean, of course, that workers would have to abandon any traditional rules of thumb that they were accustomed to using. In fact, workers were relieved of any responsibility to think at all. The system would do their thinking for them. That is crucial because it led to the idea that technique of any kind can do our thinking for us, which is among the basic principles of Technopoly, that human beings are insufficient. The assumptions that underlay the principles of scientific management did not spring all at once from the originality of Taylor's mind. They were incubated and nurtured in the technocracies of the 18th and 19th centuries, and a fair argument can be made that the origins of Technopoly are to be found in the thought of the famous 19th century French philosopher Auguste Comte, who founded both positivism and sociology in an effort to construct a science of society. Comte's arguments for the unreality of anything that could not be seen and measured certainly laid the foundation for the future conception of human beings as objects. Why did Technopoly, the submission of all forms of cultural life, the submission of all cultural forms of life to the sovereignty of technique and technology, find fertile ground on American soil? There are 4 interrelated reasons for the rise of Technopoly in America, why it emerged in America first, and why it has been permitted to flourish. As it happens, all of these have been written about extensively and many contexts are well known. The first concerns what is usually called the American character, the relevant aspect of which Tocqueville described in the early 19th century. Quote, "The American lives in a land of wonders," end quote, he wrote. Quote, "Everything around him is in constant movement, and every movement seems an advance. Consequently, in his mind, the idea of newness is closely linked with that of improvement. Nowhere does he see any limit placed by nature to the human endeavor. In his eyes, something that does not exist is just something that has not been tried," end quote. This feature of American ethos is plain to everyone who has studied American culture, although there are some wide variations in the explanation of it. Some attribute it to the immigrant nature of the population, some to the frontier mentality, some to the abundant natural resources of a singularly blessed land and the unlimited opportunities of a new continent, some to the unprecedented political and religious freedom afforded the average person, some to all of these factors and more. It is enough to say here that the American distrust of constraints, one might even say the American skepticism toward culture itself, offered encouragement to radical and thoughtless technological intrusions. Second, and inextricably related to the first, is the genius and the audacity of the American capitalists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, men who were quicker and more focused than those of other nations in exploiting the economic possibilities of new technologies. Among them are Samuel Morse, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, John D. Rockefeller, John Jacob Astor, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, and others, some of whom were known as robber barons. What they were robbing is now clear. What they were robbing, it is clearer now than it was then, was America's past. For their essential idea was that nothing is so much worth preserving that it should stand in the way of technological innovation. These were the men who created the 20th century, and they achieved wealth, prestige, and power that would have amazed even a Richard Arkwright. That's a character he had referred to earlier in the book. Didn't cover that section. The greatest achievement was in convincing their countrymen that the future need have no connection to the past. Take away the past. Are people more easy to control if they don't understand their past? If the history is corrupted? What's the Orwell quote? Control the past, control the present. He who controls the present controls the future. Right? So they control the past to control the present. They control the present to control the future. That's the notion. And amidst all of this technopoly, you also have this other thing. I don't think he covers it in the book, but it's like mass censorship in the digital age. That's for another conversation. Let's see. Let's get to the... Oh, this is a good one. Writing in our own time, C.S. Lewis believed bureaucracy to be the technical embodiment of the devil himself. Quote, I live in the managerial age, in a world of, quote, admin, end quote. The greatest evil is not now done in those sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It is not done even in concentration and labor camps. In those we see its final result. But it is conceived and ordered, moved, seconded, carried, and minuted, in clean, carpeted, warm, well-lighted offices by quiet men with soft white collars and cut fingernails and even smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voices. Hence, naturally enough, my symbol for hell is something like the bureaucracy of a police state or the office of a thoroughly nasty business concern. Following the concept of bureaucracy, bureaucracy is not in principle a social institution. Let's get that squared up. Nor are all institutions that reduce information by excluding some kind or kinds of sources necessarily bureaucracies. Schools may exclude Dianetics and astrology. Courts exclude hearsay evidence. Is it evidence if it's hearsay? Because if it was evidence, the court should admit it. I'm not sure about that. They do so for substantive reasons having to do with the theories on which these institutions are based. But bureaucracy has no intellectual, political, or moral theory, except for its implicit assumption that efficiency is the principal aim of all social institutions, and that other goals are essentially less worthy, if not irrelevant. That is why John Stuart Mill thought bureaucracy a, quote, tyranny, and C.S. Lewis identified it with hell. The transformation of bureaucracy from a set of techniques designed to serve social institutions to an autonomous meta-institution that largely serves itself came as a result of several developments of the mid and late 19th century. Rapid industrial growth, improvements in transportation and communication, the extension of government into even larger realms of public and business affairs, the increasing centralization of governmental structures. Technopoly's bureaucracy has been broken loose from such restrictions and now claims sovereignty over all of society's affairs. The peril we face in trusting social, moral, and political affairs to bureaucracy may be highlighted by reminding ourselves what a bureaucrat does. As the world's history suggests, a bureaucrat is little more than a glorified counter. The French word bureau first meant a cloth for covering a reckoning table, then the table itself, then the room in which the table was kept, and then finally the office and staff that ran the entire counting room or house. The word bureaucrat has come to mean a person who, by training, commitment, and even temperament, is indifferent to both the content and the totality of the human problem. The bureaucrat considers the implications of a decision only to the extent that the decision will affect the efficient operations of the bureaucracy and takes no responsibility for its human consequences. Thus, Adolf Eichmann becomes the basic model and metaphor for a bureaucrat in the age of Technopoly. Now, before I pause, I'm going to pause because it's Eichmann who, maybe it's Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem and or Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote both books, where Eichmann, in answering the question, how did they get these people to do all these horrific things in Nazi Germany? And his answer was Amtssprache, official language, bureaucrat speak, because in the bureaucratic language, they're only serving efficiency, right? They're not asking why the people I'll let you hear what Postman lays out, but they are outsourcing their conscience. That becomes a definition of evil, because your conscience is for you to invoke and use. And if you're under control from somebody else taking orders, that's the opposite of using your conscience. So things like what he's about to describe happen in the absence of conscience and in the presence of bureaucracies. And bureaucracies are totally about managing numbers, making sure that things are working more efficiently, and saying I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that things should work efficiently. When it's the highest thing being served in the situation and is being served at a higher level than human beings, that's when it's an ill and not a good. It's a liability, not an asset. When faced with the charge of crimes against humanity, he argued that he had no part in the formulation of Nazi political or sociological theory. He dealt only with the technical problems of moving vast numbers of people from one place to another. Why they were being moved, and especially what would happen to them when they arrived at their destination, were not relevant to his job. Although the jobs of bureaucrats in today's Technopoly have results far less horrific, Eichmann's answer is probably given 5,000 times a day in America alone. I have no responsibility for the human consequences of my decisions. I am only responsible for the efficiency of my part of the bureaucracy, which must be maintained at all costs. When people tell you, sorry, I don't want to do this, I'm just doing my job, it's the same thing. Eichmann, it must also be noted, was an expert. And expertise is the second important technical means by which Technopoly strives to furiously control information. There have, of course, always been experts, even in tool-using cultures. The pyramids, Roman roads, the Strasbourg Cathedral could hardly have been built without experts. But the expert in Technopoly has two characteristics that distinguish him or her from the experts of the past. First, Technopoly's experts tend to be ignorant about any matter not directly related to their specialized area. The average psychotherapist, for example, barely has even superficial knowledge of literature, philosophy, social history, art, religion, and biology, and is not expected to have such knowledge. Second, like the bureaucracy itself, with which an expert may or may not be connected, Technopoly's experts claim dominion not only over technical matters, but also over social, psychological, and moral affairs. In the United States, we now have experts in how to raise our children, how to educate them, how to be lovable, how to make love, how to influence people, how to make friends. There is no aspect of human relations that has not been technicalized and therefore relegated to the control of experts. These special characteristics of the expert arose as a result of three factors. He goes into the factors and how they affect us over time. He talks about the development of IQ tests and how they're like, oh, we can just associate numbers with how smart people are, and that works. That's foolproof. Let me go back to one must note. So this is from his chapter on computer technology, because we're going to go past Gutenberg. One must note, for example, the use of computer-generated images in the phenomenon known as virtual reality. Putting on a set of miniature goggles putting on a set of miniature goggle-mounted screens. One may block out the real world and move through a simulated three-dimensional world which changes its components with every movement of one's head. That Timothy Leary is an enthusiastic proponent of virtual reality does not suggest that there is a constructive future for the device. But who knows? Perhaps for those who can no longer cope with the real world, virtual reality will be better therapy than Eliza. It's another reference to a chapter I'm not going to bring you today. Can't read you the whole book. Just got to bring you some nuggets so you might find out why you would want to read such a book or prioritizing it accordingly. Here's some good tech right here. Invisible technologies. Now, we were talking about this on Discord earlier today, the concept of the number 0. All right. It's a technology. So numbers are technology, and the concept of 0 is a technology. Without it, you couldn't have this meeting because it's all binary, ones and zeros. Can't have this meeting with just ones. Aside from language itself, I don't suppose there is a clearer example of technology that doesn't look like one than the mathematical sign known as 0. A brief word about it might help to illuminate later examples. The 0 made its way from India to Europe in the 10th century because they got past 9. They're like, what do we do now? Do we go back to 1? The Indian people said, no, you can add 0 and go to 10. That's not what happened. By the 13th century, it had taken hold of Western consciousness. It was unknown to the Romans and the classical Greeks, although analogous concepts were known to the Babylonian mathematicians of the Hellenistic or Greek period. Without the 0, you'll find it quite difficult to perform any of the calculations that are quite simple to do with it. If you should try multiplying this number in Roman numerals via this number, you will have this point confirmed. I read Roman numerals, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know, is that 6,000? 1, 2,000. Anyway, you get the point. It's not easy to do math without 0, and it's also easier to do math with Arabic numbers. At least at this point in history where we live, right? I have been told, by the way, that such calculation can be confirmed, can be done, but the process is so laborious that the task is unlikely to be completed, a truth that did not escape the notice of medieval mathematicians. There is, in fact, no evidence that Roman numerals were ever used or intended to be used for calculation. For that purpose, mathematicians used an abacus, and between the 10th and 13th centuries, a struggle of sorts took place between abacists and the abacists, that's the word, abacists, who wrote Roman numerals but calculated with the abacus, and the algorists, who used Hindu numerals employing the 0 sign. The objection raised by the abacists is that the 0 registered the absence of a power of 10, which no Roman numeral did, and which struck them as philosophically and perhaps aesthetically offensive. After all, the 0 is a sign that affects values of numerals, wherever it occurs, but has no value in itself. It is a sign about signs, whose very etymology via cipher, from the Hindu word for void, suggests the idea of nothingness. To the abacists, it was a bizarre idea to have a sign marking nothing, and I fear that I would have agreed and sided with the abacists. I speak of the 0 for 2 reasons. First, to underscore that it is a kind of technology that makes both possible and easy certain kinds of thoughts which, without it, would remain inaccessible to the average person. If it does not exactly have an ideology, it contains at least an idea. I have previously alluded to the technology of using letters or numbers to grade students' papers and to the Greek discovery of the technology of alphabetization. Like the use of 0, these are examples of how symbols may function like machines in creating new mindsets and therefore new conceptions of reality. Second, the use of the 0 and, of course, the Hindu numbering system of which it was made a part made possible a sophisticated mathematics, which in turn led to one of the most powerful technologies now in use, statistics. So he goes into statistics. It's a little dry to read, but if we go over to the next page, he picks it up with some ideas that might blend in with other concepts we've discussed in prior episodes. Perhaps the most abusive example is found in the work of Francis Galton, who was born in 1822, died in 1911, and therefore lived during the richest period of technological invention. He may be thought of as one of the founding fathers of Technopoly. Galton is also known as being the founder of eugenics, a term he coined which means the science of arranging marriage and family so as to produce the best possible offspring based on the hereditary characteristics of the parents. He believed that anything could be measured and that statistical procedures in particular were the technology that could open the pathway to real knowledge about every form of human behavior. The next time you watch a televised beauty contest in which women are ranked numerically, you should remember Francis Galton, whose pathological romance with numbers originated this form of idiocy. Being unsatisfied with vagueness about where the most beauty was to be found, he constructed a beauty map of the British Isles. As he told us, he classified, quote, the girls I passed on the streets or elsewhere as attractive, indifferent, or repellent. He then provided statistically that London had the most beautiful girls, Aberdeen the ugliest. This no doubt made it awkward for Galton to spend his vacation in Scotland. If this were not enough, he also invented a method for quantifying boredom by counting the number of fidgets, and he even proposed a statistical inquiry for determining the efficacy of prayer. But Galton's main interest was in demonstrating statistically the inheritance of intelligence. To that end, he established a laboratory at the International Exposition of 1884, where, for 3 pence, people could have their skulls measured and receive Galton's assessment of their intelligence. Apparently, a visitor received no extra credit for demanding his or her money back, which would surely have been the sign of intelligence. We can be sure that not many did, since Galton was considered a major intellect of his day. In fact, Louis Terman, the man most responsible for promoting IQ tests in America, calculated that Galton's IQ was more than 200. Terman, who fancied making such estimates of the dead, ranked Charles Darwin, Galton's cousin, at a mere 135, and poor Copernicus somewhere between 100 and 110. Let's go over here. I like this part. That is why David McClellan remarked, psychologists should be ashamed of themselves for promoting a view of general intelligence that has endangered such a testing program. Joseph Weitzbaum summed it up by saying, quote, few scientific concepts have so thoroughly muddled the thinking of both scientists and the general public as that of the intelligence quotient, or IQ. The idea that intelligence can be quantitatively measured along a single linear scale has caused untold harm to our society in general and to education in particular. So there's a connection between using numbers to rule over people, eugenics, and these ideas of technopoly leading to technocracy. Let's see. This one is coming from, this is still in the chapter on invisible technologies. Let's see. The beginning of this has to go up here. It is worth saying that the basic structure of business management originated in non-business context. Still, it did not take very long for the American businesses to begin to adopt the principles of Thayer, Tyler, and Whistler, and by doing so they created of what we now think of as the modern corporation, and has led John Kenneth Galbraith to remark in the New Industrial State, quote, more perhaps than machinery, massive and complex business organizations are the tangible manifestation of advanced technology, end quote. There are 2 reasons why the case of management is instructive. First, as suggested by Galbraith, management, like the zero, statistics, IQ measurement, grading papers, or polling, functions as does any technopoly. It is not made up of mechanical parts, of course. It is made up of procedures and rules designed to standardize behavior. Now, real quick, before we go on, there is one more part. End of the chapter. And so it's necessary to understand where our techniques come from and what they are good for. We must make them visible so that they may be restored to our sovereignty, meaning under our control. In the next chapter, I hope to do this with the intricate and vast ensemble of techniques that I call scientism. So he's going to talk about scientism in a minute. But before we lose this idea of technology being used to control people and the bureaucratic aspect of that, I could do this. Gulag Archipelago. These books are too big to fit under there. Solzhenitsyn. You want to learn what bureaucracy does when left unchecked? This is 100 years ago, and these are only 2 of the 3 volumes. It's a big story. It is all about technopoly, technocracy, these types of advancements in technique being used to control human beings. What they could do today, what they're in the midst of ramping up to do today, is so much more horrific than what the Soviets could have done 100 years ago. But it's a good understanding of where bureaucracies go, and also eventually where the weak points in those bureaucracies are, so that you can regain some semblance of freedom in your life. But it's not an easy struggle, and it's not an easy read. And if you think reading is hard, it's tough to read a big book, think about going through the camps described in the book. Then you won't feel so sorry for yourself when you try to read a couple pages. Works for me. Got me through that whole book. All right. They want to standardize behavior. That's scientism. He goes in and covers scientism. Let's jump in over here because he touches back on Comte. And we had earlier reference in the earlier chapter. The most famous expression of what may be called the scientific hubris appeared in Pierre-Simon Laplace's Essai philosophique sur de les probabilités, published in 1814. I'm guessing it has something to do with statistics. He wrote, quote, a mind in a, let's see, just make sure I get this lined up. A mind that in a given circumstance knew all the forces by which nature is animated and the position of the bodies in which it is composed. If it were vast enough to include all these data within his analyses, could embrace one single formula of the movements of the largest bodies of the universe and of the smallest atoms. Nothing would be uncertain for him. The future and the past would be equally before his eyes. End quote. There is, of course, no scientist today who takes this view seriously, and there are few enough who did in the 19th century. But the spirit behind this scientific ideal inspired several men to believe that the reliable and predictable knowledge that could be obtained about the stars and atoms could also be obtained about human behavior. Among the best known of these early social scientists were Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon and Prosper Enfantin, and of course Auguste Comte. They held in common two beliefs to which Technopoly is deeply indebted: that the natural sciences provide a method to unlock the secrets of both the human heart and the direction of social life; that society can be rationally and humanely reorganized according to principles that social science will uncover. It is with these men that the idea of social engineering begins, and the seeds of scientism are planted. By scientism, I mean 3 interrelated ideas that, taken together, stand as one of the pillars of Technopoly. 2 of the 3 have just been cited. The first and most indispensable idea is, as noted, that the methods of the natural sciences can be applied to the study of human behavior. This idea is the backbone of much of psychology and sociology as practiced, at least in America, and largely accounts for the fact that social science to quote F.A. Hayek, quote, has contributed scarcely anything to our understanding of social phenomena, end quote. The second idea is also noted that social science generates specific principles that can be used to organize a society on a rational and humane basis. This implies that technological means, mostly invisible technologies supervised by experts, can be designed to control human behavior and set it on the proper course. The third idea is that faith in science can serve as a comprehensive belief system that gives meaning to life, as well as a sense of well-being, morality, and even immortality. I wish here to show how these ideas spiral into each other and how they give science, or how they give energy and form to Technopoly. The term science, I love this part of the book. The term science, as it is generally used today, referring to the work of those in the physical, chemical, and biological disciplines, was popularized in the early 19th century with significant help from the formation of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1831. Although Murray's New English Dictionary, gives 1867 as the earliest use of the term in the modern sense. By the early 20th century, the term had been appropriated by others, and it has since become increasingly familiar as a description of what psychologists, sociologists, and even anthropologists do. It will come to no surprise that I claim this is a deceptive and confusing use of the term, in part because it blurs the distinction between process and practices. Using definitions proposed by British philosopher Michael Oakeshott, we may say that processes refers to those events that occur in nature, such as the orbiting of the planets or the melting of ice or the production of chlorophyll in a leaf. Such processes have nothing to do with human intelligence, are governed by immutable laws, and are, so to say, determined by the structure of nature. If one were so inclined, one might even say that processes are the creation of God. By practices, on the other hand, Oakeshott means the creations of people, those events that result from human decisions and actions, such as writing or reading this book, or forming new government, or conversing at dinner, or falling in love. These events are a function of human intelligence, interacting with the environment. And although there is surely a measure of regularity in human affairs, such affairs are not determined by natural laws, immutable or otherwise. In other words, there is an irrevocable difference between a blink and a wink. A blink can be classified as a process. It has physiological causes, which can be understood and explained within the context of established postulates and theories. But a wink must be classified as a practice, filled with personal and to some extent unknowable meanings, and in any case, quite impossible to explain or predict in terms of causal relations. What we call science, then, is the quest to find the immutable and universal laws that govern processes, presuming that there are cause and effect relations among these processes. It follows that the quest to understand human behavior and the feeling can in no sense accept the most trivial, let me go back to the beginning of that sentence. It follows that the quest to understand human behavior and feeling can in no sense accept the most trivial be called science. One can, of course, point to the fact that students of both natural law and human behavior often quantify their observations, and on this common ground classify them together. A fair analogy would be to argue that since a house painter and an artist both use paint, they are engaged in the same enterprise and to the same end. The scientist uses mathematics to assist in uncovering and describing the structure of nature. At best, sociologists, to take one example, use quantification merely to give some precision to their ideas. But there is nothing especially scientific in that. All sorts of people count things in order to achieve precision without claiming they are scientists. Bail bondsmen count the number of murders committed in their cities. Judges count the number of divorce actions in their jurisdictions. Business executives count the amount of money spent in their stores. And young children like to count their toes and fingers in order not to be vague about how many they have. Meaning that's not doing science. Information produced by counting may sometimes be valuable in helping a person get an idea, even more so in providing support for the idea. But the mere activity of counting does not make it science. Nor does observing things, though it is sometimes said that if one is empirical, one is scientific. To be empirical means to look at things before drawing conclusions. Everyone, therefore, is an empiricist, with the possible exception of paranoid schizophrenics. To be empirical also means to offer evidence that others can see as clearly as you. You may, for example, conclude that I like to write books, offering as evidence that I have written this one and several others besides. You may also offer as evidence a tape recording, which I can supply on request, on which I will tell you that I like to write books. Such evidence may be said to be empirical, and your conclusion empirically based. But you are not therefore acting as a scientist. You are acting as a rational person, to which condition many people who are not scientists may make just a claim. Scientists do not strive to be empirical and where possible and precise. Scientists do strive to be empirical and, where possible, precise, but it is also basic to their enterprise that they maintain a high degree of objectivity, which means that they study things independently of what people think or do about them. The opinions people hold about the external world are, to scientists, always an obstacle to overcome. And it is well known that the scientist's picture of the external world is quite different from what most people believe the world is like. Moreover, in their quest for objectivity, scientists proceed on the assumption that the objects they study are indifferent to the fact that they are being studied. He goes into Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which I think is highly misunderstood. I'm going to skip that part. He goes into Karl Popper. That gets kind of boring. Milgram. Here's a good part. In second place, Milgram's study was not empirical in the strict sense, since it was not based on observations of people in natural life situations. I assume that no one is especially interested in how people behave in a laboratory at Yale or any other place. What matters is how people behave in situations where their behavior makes a difference to their lives. But any conclusions that may be drawn from Milgram's study must specify that they apply only to people in laboratories under the conditions Milgram arranged. However, I would note that the present state of affairs in modern day life is very much like the Milgram laboratory that Yale engineered. So, point taken, point returned. And even if we assume a correspondence between laboratory behavior and more lifelike situations, no predictions can be made about what lifelike situations these might be, nor can any serious claim be made that there is a causal relationship between the acceptance of legitimate authority and doing what you're told. In fact, Milgram himself shows us that there are not, since 35% of his subjects told the authority figure to bug off. Moreover, Milgram had no idea why some people did and some people did not tell him to bug off. For myself, I feel quite sure that if each of Milgram's subjects had been required to read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem before showing up at the laboratory, his numbers would have been quite different. So he goes on about Milgram's experiment, which is an interesting perspective that outside of this book I had not been No one had critiqued it like that. Let's see, is there one more part? There is a part in the ending here. Oh, here we go. Final stretch. Those who resist the American Technopoly are people who pay no attention to a poll unless they know what the questions are asked, what questions are asked and why, right? So to resist the American Technopoly, these are the people who resist it, right? This is their mentality. Those who refuse to accept efficiency as the preeminent goal of human relations. Those who have freed themselves from the belief in the magical powers of numbers, do not regard calculation as an adequate substitute for judgment or precision as a synonym for truth. Those who refuse to allow psychology or any other social science to preempt the language and thought of common sense. Those who are at least suspicious of the idea of progress and who do not confuse information with understanding. Those who do not regard the aged as irrelevant. Those who take seriously the meaning of family loyalty and honor and who, when they, quote, reach out and touch someone, expect that person to be in the same room. For those of you playing at home, that was like an AT&T commercial from the 1990s last century. Reach out and touch someone. Great series. All right, those who take the great narratives of religion seriously and who do not believe that science is the only system capable of producing truth. Those who know the difference between the sacred and the profane, and who do not wink at tradition for modernity's sake. Those who admire technological ingenuity but do not think it represents the highest possible form of achievement, human achievement. The resistance fighter understands that technology must never be accepted as part of the natural order of things, that every technology, from an IQ test to an automobile to a television to a computer to a smartphone. No, I'm just kidding. Postman died 1993. There were no smartphones back then for him to reference. Is a product of a particular economic and political context and carries with it a program, an agenda, and a philosophy that may or may not be life-enhancing, and that therefore requires scrutiny, criticism, and control. In short, a technological resistance fighter maintains an epistemological and psychic distance from any technology, so that it always appears somewhat strange, never inevitable, never natural. I think we can close the book there. All right, so now I'll open it up to questions. You guys can speak freely. Enable your parrhesia mode.
I wonder how much we discriminate technology when we use it, or if we just integrate it without discrimination. That last part that you read made me thought about that.
And I think it's even more like part of our culture today with everything, all the contracts. If I put some paperwork and slide it across the table and I hand you the pen and I say, this is for you to sign, you're going to put on your glasses and you're going to read through it. You might even, call your lawyer, call your accountant, call your wife, business partners, whoever, right? I show you the agreement online, click here to authorize, and people don't read it anymore, right? So that's right there. People are losing. Who do you think's winning in those contests? The people making the offers or the people clicking, right? It used to be almost like you could have a fair negotiation. There was fairness there. But that's kind of gone out the window with the way things are going today. And that's one thing, because we went through it and we know the difference. But children today are just being born into a world where no one ever used and scrutinized contracts. So what are you, crazy? You some sort of conspiracy theorist? Nobody would take away your rights using words in a contract, right? Just sign wherever. Oh, there's a credit card, T-shirt. You get a free T-shirt at the university that you're overpaying for. Oh, and they sign this paperwork. Now you're paying, 34% interest, 27%. People don't know what they're engaging in. And that's kind of another ill effect of the technology or technopoly aspect of it, right? So freedom takes responsibility. Technology takes responsibility. They both need learning, right? There is an interdependency, but there's also a balance to keep. And what you're pointing out is the lack of discrimination, the lack of comparison and contrast, the fact that people just make decisions without doing any homework, gathering any other data. What are the opposing views? Like what is, a higher level of understanding of these concepts? And instead of doing that, they sacrifice their security, their privacy, all these different things that really add to the excellence of life. And the loss of them does not add to the excellence or freedom in your life. So it's a good place to become better educated, because I think that we end up in these situations because what we know we don't need, and what we need we don't know. But recognizing that, we can learn. We can self-direct and be like, okay, what do I actually need to understand? Well, I used a lot of technology. Maybe I should learn about some of the philosophy and history of the things that we're, surrounding ourselves with, right? We use a lot of technology just for this meeting, but if we can use it to enable ourselves and to outgrow dependency, and we can use it to communicate with each other in other ways that we normally couldn't talk, then I think that's a good thing now. But who knows, where technology takes the communication, if it's all with proxies in the future. Like, my theory is this: it won't be too long before you can't surf the internet. What do I mean by that? Right now, you can go to any number of entries. Like, the internet is like this series of tubes. I don't know if you've heard this before. Think of it like a pool, right? And you can stick like a pool. And so you can put a hose into the pool from a variety of sites. Those would be web search portals, right? Like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo. I guess Bing is Microsoft now. So there's a variety of ways to access that and to gain content from there. In the future, they're not going to want you having direct access to all that information and data and directing yourself through it. They're going to want you to ask Alexa, Alexa, and Alexa will be the proxy. And if Alexa doesn't like your question, Alexa's like, oh, sorry, no results found, right? It's like what Hal says, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Basically, it's that technological proxy barrier, and people are inviting it. They're buying it for Christmas this year. The new Facebook, and pretty soon it'll be a robot. I mean, how many years before the Facebook or Google robot for your home is available for the next Black Friday? 1 or 2 years? We're not that far off from that. And where does it go from there? Simulated lifelike Google bot or Facebook bot or whatever the, control system of the future seems to be, brand. So there's a lot going on, a lot of changes going on faster these days than ever before in human history. How do you keep up with it? Well, the first way is to slow it down, realize what's going on. What did other people who got here before us, did they leave us any useful information, right? I think Postman was born in 1911. He died in 2003. Maybe that's not accurate, because I thought he was only 73 when he died. Anyway, he passed away almost 20 years ago. The things that he was pointing out even back in 1992, the virtual reality aspect was a very nascent idea back then. I think there was only like one Hollywood film that had been produced about virtual reality at that point. Maybe it was Lawnmower Man. But these ideas have come full circle to the point where some people could take out their smartphone, attach it to the goggles, and they're in virtual reality world, right? And this is only going to become something that they're going to offer more readily with less technological, because the way Postman's like, you would have a screen in front of each eye. Well, yeah, but that was a big idea back then to have a screen. Now it's just like that. Those little LEDs can be put anywhere, those screens. So it's not that he's a prophet. He didn't, he predicted a future, but the future he predicted was already in motion and being planned back then. He's just writing about it to point it out. To be like, yeah, this is where they're trying to take it. Why would they want to take people away from learning and participating in reality? Because it makes it a whole lot easier to control the real world, to create like artificial false realities to spin people off into. That's the technological evolution of bread and circus. People think they're just watching their screens doing Netflix or video games now, but soon it's going to go to full-time like VR. And they'll just, I think there was a recent like Bruce Willis movie, Surrogates, about that, where people all just exist in the VR world. So, all right. So questions, comments, who from the gallery? Or do you guys just, like I said, it's good to hear a book, get some value out of it. It's like a audio movie book.
Richard, I think there's certainly, I think one of the points you made in regard to scientism and the idea of classifying experts as scientists or conducting science as something that was really important, I think, that he hit on. And that is that, we think that because technology is one thing, that because there's experts in those, that they know what they're talking about. And certainly falling for that kind of idea of expertise in a particular area as being something that we really need to be cognizant of and skeptical of when it comes to new technologies in particular and what they're promising us in regards to what the improvements are versus what the problems could be.
Well, that brings up the point of like, all right, so we've heard what Postman had to say about this in 1992. I'm not going to do this book next because I don't want to stay on one theme. I want to bounce around, deliver value in a variety of places. But Technocracy Rising, the Trojan horse of global transformation, is all based basically on the ideas that we just learned about in Technopoly. So you take these ideas to the next level. There's a lot of interesting aspects described in the book that are still in motion today. All the global warming, climate change, hysteria that's going on out there. That was preordained and planned, and it's there to be a divisive issue because of how they present it. And these ideas of using artificial experts and scientism, like I believe there's good uses for science. I don't believe all the people who claim that they're scientists know what science is. Science is not, let's take a consensus and find out what's true. Right? Science is not starting with, let's have a hypothesis and only go look for information that supports it. And yet a lot of the people who are like, oh, the science is, it's settled. Science is never settled. Science is an ongoing thing by its very nature. You must not know what you're talking about. Are you using the right word? Right? No one has these, that's not the polite retort, but that is a retort. And you do need to start thinking about what can be said to these empty-minded ideas other than to question whether or not the people purveying those actually understand them and can maybe help you understand, or they're just spouting a bunch of hot air that they heard somebody else repeat and they barely understand how to pronounce the syllables, let alone transmit enough value for you to take and have utility from it, right? So it's about having these conversations be more discerning, but having something common to talk about. So for instance, if I gave you this book, Technocracy Rising, and I said, hey, there's this thing going on. This book describes it. Well, it does, but it describes it in such a way it's a little bit more advanced, and people would choose to say, oh, Patrick Wood, he's a Christian, so he's writing from a Christian angle, right? So there's that aspect, because when he talks about scientism, people want to jump to the other side. It's like, oh, what are you, creationist, right? They want to put labels on people and oversimplify who you are as a human being. But we don't help them with that when we only have superficial understandings, right? Like we play into that until you start to gain enough information to get out of that. So before introducing something like this that could be kind of arbitrarily dismissed, but dismissed nonetheless, the information is not getting to that person. You have a much more establishment book that familiarizes them with how it's left unchecked, left unquestioned, technophiles and their thirst for just making things better for not for the end user, but for the numbers, it's questionable. And the effects on our society, I mean, I'm sure they worked a whole bunch of numbers to negotiate with themselves why it was a good idea to do Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were statistics involved. There was bureaucrat speak. I mean, if you think of some of the highest uses of human intelligence that have led to some of the greatest disasters, or like the ongoing threat of disaster, that's definitely up there. Not necessarily just because you can to do that, right? But that goes to CERN. What is CERN over there? What's that project? That's science for the sake of numbers, not with any tangible benefits to average human beings, many of which who are funding it in some way, shape, or form through supporting the people who run it, right? They're not getting their money from nowhere, and the people who have the money to fund it got it from somewhere, usually from the labor of individuals who are out there working. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of technology that can go sideways pretty quickly. And we're not really producing people out of the school system anymore that has the aptitude, inclination, culture of excellence, attention to details to maintain and keep a nuclear plant online, for example. And as they start to dismantle them, even dismantling a nuclear plant takes like 50 years to dismantle because they figured out how to boil water with some radioactive stuff, right? So these aren't necessarily the long-term solutions we want to leave with humanity. We should take them as these are imperfect solutions. What makes them imperfect? How can we do something that makes them better that we can deliver back to human beingness to improve lives? Because if there's a positive benefit to technology, it is in the human experience. It is for the sake of human experience, not for the sake of efficiency or maintaining the numbers in a bureaucracy. And that's really the distinction that Postman's bringing to the forefront, insofar as scientism and the technophiles are all about improving efficiency regardless of the cost to humanity. And the other side is saying, hey, we like technology too. Maybe we should just look at the consequences and make these decisions at all instead of just assuming that improving technology all the time is a good thing as fast as possible.
Something else I'd just like to mention is, in regard to kind of the Brave New World and the before Ford and after Ford kind of concept of mass production as being kind of the beginning of the technocracy. I think there's some other consideration that might be, really useful in regard to people thinking about the potential of what could have been if we would have took it in a different direction other than just mass production. Like the idea of like the Heath kit, back in I can remember in the 70s and the 80s when, you could kind of create your own radio or ham radio or something like that. But, like if we could take that 3D printing kind of concept and create people that understand that like these parts and pieces could be molded into a bunch of different solutions to problems rather than just one mass-produced solution to a problem, we could create a circumstance in which people really realize that the potential of creativity utilizing things like mass-produced parts to create different solutions could be a whole new way of us to innovate and even like redirect something like an industrial revolution for the masses, in which they use their creative mind to take these parts and pieces that may be mass produced, but don't actually end up as the same solution. I think we really have the opportunity to demonstrate that there are different ways to approach this that can use the human mind in a way that most people aren't really thinking about, but it could mean, so many new solutions to problems that we're really not even contemplating because everybody is so directed in this one mindset that technology is this thing where once we have a solution to a problem, we mass produce it and everybody gets the same solution. It doesn't have to be like that.
Well, there's also the aspect that, like, people devise solutions for the times they live in, and then sometimes those solutions make it to a future time when they're used in not so good a way. Like, I don't have a critique against Hegel himself, but there are some people who have used his philosophy that I think are morally corrupt and have caused the world a lot of damage. Marx the same way. Like, I don't have anything against the guy himself. Like, he's a function of his circumstances. We all are. So I don't hold people accountable for the things they can't control. Where you're born, what color your skin is, what religion you're brought up with, these sort of things, where I come from, are not the characteristics to judge people by. You judge them by the integrity of their character, not by the things, because that's the thing that they can control, that their choices lead up to, right? The other things are not within their control, and so it's not reasonable or polite to use those as part of a judgment. That's where I'm coming from with it. I might not have finished the whole thought, but that happens when you do it live. Any other closing comments, questions, observations, insights, inspirations, things you took away from learning a little bit more about the technology that's around us. And it's not that technology bad, right? Like as a human being, you better have technology if you want to survive outside. You need some technology called shelter. You need some technology called fire. You need tools to get that done. You want to get some food, you're going to need some technology for that. So human beings can't exist really without technology. If you take their technology away, it's like cruel and inhumane. But how fast to adopt new technologies and to ask questions before adopting those new technologies, I think is the valuable gain from what Postman lays out throughout his 3 or 4 major books that are worthy of consideration.
So I wanted to chime in for a second.
How you doing, Adam?
I'm good tonight, Richard. How are you?
I'm outstanding, and I like seeing the scene in the car. I like it. Technology in action. Where else could we get that? Did you have a computer, a desktop in there with a webcam and a microphone? How are you doing that in the car?
No, this is on a smartphone.
Oh, geez. Hi.
All right. So I was, as you were talking about technology sort of having its own idea, I was thinking back to something I heard on from Terrence McKenna about how people don't have ideas. You know, ideas have people. And I guess the twist to it that I got coming out of this reference. 1 second, fucking. Okay. The twist I got out of this was that technology itself is an idea, right? So this idea of car, of smartphone. You know, I know when I first got mine in my mid-20s for smartphone, like that idea definitely held me, and I was always looking in my pocket the internet. Sage. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Technology is an idea that, without examination, can possess us until we take the time to examine it, think about the consequences.
So technology, I mean, literacy is a form of technology, right? And unless you have critical thinking. So critical thinking is, technology is a form of slavery until critical thinking is possessed by the user. Like you have to be scrutinized when you use technology. And that's what Postman says. He's like, here's 4 or 5 questions that when adopting a new technology, you should always consider. The government or whoever, like organizations, questions they can use, same thing. So it works for individuals, works for groups. And in too few cases, people are educated enough to ask those questions. You know, if we start using this new technology, then what is the thing that becomes obsolete? What is the thing we stop using because we stopped doing it? Like, what are the changes that take place? What are the value? How does it make things better? And then how does it make things worse? And most people are just taught to look at how it makes things better.
Yeah, I can get behind all of that. And to sort of piggyback off that, I mean, what about all the technology that's out in DARPA world and highly classified or got its own special classification that we don't even know about? Those technologies have consequences that we're going to have to, as we find out about them, adapt to as quickly as possible. So I've kind of got my heads up and my ears pricked up looking for stuff like that too, in terms of what's necessary for some intellectual or possibly even physical self-defense.
Well, it's a valid point because, first off, National Security Act was signed in 1947. So since then, under the guise of national security, they have been able to take tax dollars, skim them off, all sorts of stuff, black budgets, black market budgets, covert actions, these sort of things. So there's a huge amount of money that's been put into the development of technology, which is not delivered back to the people who paid the taxes, and it never will be because it's not owned by the corporation. It's owned by the bureaucracy above the corporation, that is the country. So the military contractors, the pharmaceutical companies, the power elite families that still exist, even though we think we got rid of that sort of thing. We have representative government. That's not really how the world works. So those uber layers, and they're all just being born into a bureaucracy which they maintain, right? So you could call the bureaucracy New World Order, as H.G. Wells did, but The idea is it's very much like what Eichmann was talking about. These people don't even have to have intelligent knowledge over what they're doing, and they just do what they're told. They act their part. They play their script that's been written for them by somebody else. They're automatons instead of being autonomous, right? So that is going on out there, and what can you do? You're going to be subservient to it until you at least learn it exists, and then you can start to recognize areas where, oh, maybe, spending this much time on video games, or the kids spending so much time watching nonsense, these sort of things. It's people playing games on Facebook, doing just random things that are liabilities, not assets in their lives, right? They're not learning something that they can use long term that's going to bring them tangible benefits or any sort of progression toward their goals, right? It's a time suck instead of a time investment, because the investment means you get some sort of asset out of it, as opposed to in the time suck situation, it's a liability. That's not being encouraged too many places because nobody knows how to make money off of it. So they encourage the bread and circus. They encourage, here's another season of your favorite series on Netflix. Here's another version of the game you've already played, right? Now, if you're the developer of a game, that's cool. I can dig that. But just being a consumer of other people's creativity, is that the best you can do over life? I mean, you might not know how to do it now, but you can learn. And if you start on the process, like that's the only way to get there, is to get started and take a step, right? And then you start to, tap into your potential and ignite it and direct it toward a goal of your means. And then you can actually have more meaning and satisfaction. But you're not going to get it just blindly adopting more technology. Like, oh, I'm feeling down. Maybe I should get a new iPhone. Maybe that'll make me feel better, right? Like the things that people are buying, newer and greater things, it's not necessarily for form, function, or performance that would actually enable them to do something. One of the other stories I heard Postman talk about, because I rewatched some of his talks over the past week, the notion of faster than the speed of sound air travel. And how the British and the French, they had Concords. The Russians even developed a Concorde. The Soviets did. So the Americans were going to do that, and basically it would decrease airline travel from 6 hours down to 3 hours. And they thought it was too much of an expense to justify that type of project. So what they did was, because what did people do? They saved time. And what would they do with that time? They'd watch more TV. So they just put TVs on the planes and kept the planes flying slow. Much more efficient and effective solution.
Oh, wow. Yeah, there you go. No, it's a conversation that I have to have with myself, and I have with my family too. Like, hey, why are we buying this? Is it just because you're going for a feeling? Like, what is this actually going to help you do better or more? And I don't know. I'm not yet successfully communicating, because the response is usually something close to an eye roll. But I'm working on it.
Right on. It takes it takes a little persistence despite resistance, and then you actually have communication after a while, But a bridge has to be built, and that bridge is going to be built, in this case, with words. We're going to use language and literacy to our advantage, hopefully, and not have it be a detriment. Anyone else with thoughts from today's reading assignment? Technopoly, the surrender of culture to technology. All right, so we put about 2 hours into learning a little bit about Technopoly. This is a 1992 book. If you think there was enough interest that you want to put it on your list, check it out. Otherwise, it's about understanding the concept of sacrificing elements of our culture to technology, the face-to-face interactions that you have with family and friends that add a lot of value to life. Like, people today on their deathbed, what are they going to be thinking back to? Oh, I remember that Skype call with so-and-so. There's no human element. Like, you're not in the midst of life when you're doing those things. So this is a high degree of communication that we're conducting here, right? But there are higher and richer and more detailed interactions to be had in life. And this is preferable to not having enough information to get started. But eventually the idea is to take the ideas that you learn on the internet, that you internalize into yourself, to take those out into the real world. And not saying that in real life, it has all the paramount facets. It doesn't trump talking over the internet, right? There are values to both, but for a lot of people, it's becoming only one and not the other. And I think it's an also and. Like, I'm not a Luddite, but I'm also not a technophile. Like, I understand that there's a happy medium and that you need to be discerning. And I think that my life is richer and more substantial, and I have more meaningful interactions and get more out of my time because I'm not trying to avoid it all, but I'm also not trying to embrace it all without reason, right? And so I think as more people can find the middle and they get away from waiting in line for the next newest phone, and they actually get back to, what do I need? How does a phone add value to my life? Can my phone facilitate those activities? And if so, your phone's working, it's all good. Move to the next decision you have to make. There's probably other things in life you need to spend money on that would probably give you more satisfaction, right? That was some of the conversations that went on in Discord today between meetings. Various ways you could take liabilities in your life, turn them into assets, and get a lot more satisfaction. That was the topic of conversation. But enough for this meeting. This is the exit of Smart Reads. This is episode 2. Next Wednesday, 4 o'clock, we'll do History Connected in the regular studio. And I will not be talking about Technopoly. I will have, I'm not going to do back-to-back, like in there, out here about the same book again. It happened this one time, but I would like to keep it more varied and mixed to embolden your ability to have interest and maintain your attention. So until next time, thank you for tuning in and not dropping out. And for those of you listening live here, thanks for showing up. And I'll catch you guys over on Discord. Peace.